Well, what I thought we would do today is just kind of look at a variety of architectural sort of forms slash types, typologies. And those of you that know me, I'm a splitter. I like to sort of narrow things down. So we're going to talk about some of that, how that all kind of came about, some options, where to find more information about these kind of building forms and typologies, because I certainly can't go over all of them and just to kind of grease the wheels and get your thought process sort of thinking as you're out there recording historic resources across the state or even other places because a lot of this terminology comes from other places and then sort of brought here to the West as we'll see. Um, I think probably the first thing to sort of think about the way that I think of style and architectural form, the real difference for me, the easiest way to kind of think about these things is style is sort of applied ornamentation to a building. So if you think about just the outside of a building, what is sort of attached to the outside? This is kind of a general sort of a thing. So applied ornamentation, and then the form slash type is really the combination of the external appearance, the layout, the structure, the floor plan, the massing, the size, things like that, sort of the unity of the design as a whole. In general, this might be a little oversimplification of things, but that's an easy way to kind of think about the difference between style and form when you're I've been thinking a lot about split level because I'm going to be doing a lecture on split level and split entry later this fall. And so this is when we look at the split entry, this is a good way to look at it, right? I think everybody knows what a split entry sort of building is. It's the form itself, right? It's a two-story building and it's got the entrance sort of midway between the two floors. But if you look at the style that's applied to these buildings, they look all very different. So you've got an American, early American style, a Tudor style, a contemporary style, a Mansard style. So they're all split levels, but they look different because of that applied architectural ornamentation on the outside. It's kind of a good, fun way, easy one to look at. That can be applied to lots of different um, building forms as we look through them. Yeah, and you'll see that as we go through the slides. So that's a good thing to think about. And the architecture world, so if you are an architect, trained licensed architect, you would think of sort of building form as kind of the mass solids versus voids. These are kind of terminology that they throw around. Collision of shapes, the orientation of the building, subtractive and additive things, dimensions and portions and scale. In the preservation world, we don't really think of building form quite in that much detail. We're more talking about the plan and the elevations and sort of families of shapes and how they come together. Sometimes the structural systems, the facade, the symmetry, things like that is what we look at when we talk about sort of building forms and typologies. Kind of using those two terms sort of intermittent together because they're really both the same, at least in the preservation world that we're all in. Um, and here's another split entry sort of scenario. Nobody can seem to agree in the preservation world. So when I started looking at split entries, I was just looking across the country to see what other people were calling these kinds of things. So in Virginia, they're calling them foyers. In McAllister's guide, that everybody uses, she calls them bi-level splits. In Indiana, they're just called bi-levels or raised ranches in Colorado. I'm big on using sort of period catalogs and newspaper articles and things, and they call them high ranches. Um, in our world, a raised ranch second has the door on the second floor with massive steps going up to it, but still with the basement exposed. But in the split entry, it's right in the middle. So in Washington State, we're using the term split entry, based on what we see versus newspaper articles, what was selling sort of at the time period. So nobody can agree on what these terms are. So what I'm telling you might be completely different from maybe a guidebook that you pick up or a book somewhere else. And I've sort of, you're getting inside Michael's brain to sort of pull all these things together and what we're using here in Washington State. And we're using a lot of stuff. Um, I looked at Oregon to see what they were using. These are their forms in Oregon at the Oregon SHPO. It's a pretty small list, right? A-frames, bungalows, Cape Cods, although some people might think of Cape Cod as a house style, commercial, four square mobile home, ranch, shed. There's our split entry. So not many down in Oregon. Then I looked at period newspaper articles. I just looked at the Seattle Times for a couple of years, and I was like, what are they calling sort of building forms during the time period? And these are kind of crazy sort of things. So, what is a Century Rambler or a Snow White Cape Cod, um, or a Snow White Normandy? What are these things? What do they actually look like on the ground? To sort of decipher this idea between style and typology. And frankly, I'm not sure if I've come up with the answer to most of these. What's a Nevada style ranchette? We don't even really use the term rambler in common terminology in the preservation world really anywhere. It's kind of a real estate sort of term. Um, so this is DAHP's version, Washington State version of terminology. It greatly expands Oregon's for sure. There are 148 different options in the pick list, which you might say, Michael, this is crazy. Why do we do that sort of thing? So one of the things that we've done is kind of break them down into sort of bigger categories. So there's typologies for barns, there's typologies for bridges, typologies for churches, commercial, so forth. Some of these are just a single category. Some of these have broken down into subcategories. So when you're in Wizard and you're picking up the pick list, which is under form type, the idea is that if you don't know what the subtype is, that you would just pick the overall one. So single dwelling, domestic, and then if you know the subtype, you can pick the subtype. And ideally, in a search mechanism, if you picked commercial, you would get all the commercial related typology to come up at once. Or if you want to get down into the dirty, you could pick a subtype in that. So you could pick Working Man's Foursquare and just get those individual design philosophies. So I think that's working. Kim, isn't that working at the moment, that kind of search?
That works pretty good.
Yeah, it works pretty good. I
Yeah.
mean, Wizard has its quirks, we all know that, but it's something. And, why in the world would we do this? Why do we have all this sort of breakdown? Why do we have 148 different terms? And I think the answer is pretty easy because it's chaos in the database. And it's chaos because there are currently 650,000 entries in Wizard. So, for instance, if you used gas station as a type, as a terminology for a building form, not necessarily use, but if you looked at it for a building form, you would get all kinds of crazy things like this. And when you look at these things, you're like, sure, it's a gas station, but they look very different, right? So you can find them by use, but maybe you want to find one that is just a central box with a canopy, or a single box, or a double box, or something like that. So that breakdown of the system allows us to have some sort of structure to the chaos and to be easily be able to find stuff and do that comparative analysis that is often needed when we're talking about rarity of properties, when we're talking about listings on the register, on the local register or national register. What are comparable examples to that? Is this rare? Is it unique? Is it common? That sort of thing. So gas stations are fun. One of the books that I like to use for gas station, probably the best one out there, is this book called Gas Stations in America. I don't know if anybody's read it, but it's a great book, has a great typology in there, and most of the typologies that we're using are from this book. So that's a good one to add to your library. Now, the classification systems themselves, they can be broken down into several different ways. They can be broken down into use or purpose of a building. Sometimes the plan, the shape, and the massing can be used. Sometimes the structural system, sometimes the roof form, like what we do for barn typologies. Barn forms, we're using mainly the roof form. But you could, in a barn sort of scenario, you could use the use as a barn, but that doesn't necessarily tell us something, particularly from the street, right? And it's hard to tell the use without getting into these buildings. And as you all know, we're doing a lot of this evaluation right off the street, right, from the public right of way. So you can't get to that sort of deeper level off the top. So those are kind of things to think about different ways. And you'll see as the breakdown comes through and you look at that, uh, they're different. There's not a lot of consistency there in terms of what sort of classification system you might be using. For instance, bridges, sort of when the first kind of typologies came out about bridges, they were really focused in kind of on the truss system of the bridge, that structural steel or wood, how it was put together. And those early ones were named after engineers who came up with the design. So there's a Mr. Howe. I don't know his first name in, but he came up with that particular design, or a Parker truss, or a Baltimore truss, things like that. But as we sort of evaluated more recent bridges, that don't necessarily have a structural system like that, you've got to add different sort of things. So you've got to add a slab bridge or a steel girder bridge. Um, or a deck truss bridge. And I noticed even going through this, I'm like, hey, the Ione bridge up here from 1932, it's a deck truss bridge, right? Because the truss is below the deck. But we don't actually have that as as a property type. So if you were looking for it in the database, you wouldn't be able to find it. But certainly somebody could be interested in knowing, well, how many other of these deck types do we have? So, sorry, Kim, it's going to be something we got to add another typology to the list to be able to find these sorts of things. So that's something to think about, right? There's certain types, things change with technology, and we have to think about shifting how we do those mid-century resources as well. And there's not a lot of literature out there about typologies and forms of post-World War II structures. So it's something that's kind of still fresh on the minds of many preservationists. One that's kind of interesting to find, although in our database, Quonset huts, there's just a single Quonset hut entry in there, but there are many different subtypes of Quonset huts. We have not gotten into the idea of what all these various subtypes are or could be in our database. But this is a scenario where the subtypes are based on the manufacturer and or the orientation slash the material of the Quonset hut itself, whether it's corrugated metal that's being bended clear around that U-shaped form, or it's a horizontal use. Lots of different sort of ways to look at that. And some of these are more rare than others. So if you were to try and find an MK hut in the state, there's only a half a dozen or so that I know of that have been recorded, at least. Actually, most of those haven't even been really recorded. So something to think about there. Quonset huts. I know everybody gets excited about Quonset huts, but let me tell you, these things are quickly disappearing bad. He's giving me the thumbs up. Thank you. Thank you. What about earth shelters? One of the things that I have tried to do is just be a little bit ahead of the curve in terms of what we might be thinking about in Washington State, in terms of resources that are coming of age, right? And there are earth shelters in Washington. Very, very few have been recorded. But when we start to think about recording them, how do we differentiate which ones are out there and what do they mean? So I've never seen a good categorization of them, but these are the kind of the three types that I've defined by looking at period catalogs and design books that were pushing underground shelter designs. And this is a map that I found in a magazine actually that's talking about where all the underground dwellings are. And you can see in Washington, there's quite a few in terms of some of the other states, but Midwest is the place to be if you want to live underground. Um, there's some fun ones out there. So those are something to think about. Earth Shelter is a pick list, but not a sub pick list. So it's got the Earth Shelter, but it doesn't have the sub list in there. Something to think about as well. Okay. So now you kind of have an overall sort of view of the crazy database and why it's like that. Let's think about, what to sort of look at. So when I start to look at architecture, from the street, I look at all kinds of things that can tell us about the building. So that can give me quick ideas on how to catalog it, how to date it. You look at things like how many stories a building is. Is it one story? Is it two stories? Is it one and a half stories? Right? This is kind of an unusual sort of thing. So the general public might think like the building down on the bottom left, well, that's a two-story house, but in the preservation world, that's a story and a half, right? Because the second story is within the pitch of the roof. So that's the half story. So two and a half or one and a half, two and a half, like the four square that we see up on the top. If you're so lucky, floor plans can tell us many things about buildings as well, but we usually don't get into buildings, right, when we're doing quick recon level surveys. You should be looking at things like the roof form itself. What's the shape of the roof form? That'll often date a building. If you see a mansard roof, it's going to be probably from the 1880s or it's going to be from the 1980s. Those sorts of things, quickly kind of tell us about different styles, different forms, different dates of buildings. Those are always fun to look at. You could even look at crazy things like where the heck is the roof? Where is the chimney on the roof? What are the details of the chimney? Is it on the ridge? Is it on a slope? Can you see it from the outside? Is it on the end? Is it in the front? Um, those kinds of things. What styles of dormers does it have? Eyebrow dormers and segmental dormers and gable wall dormers and shed wall dormers. Um, all of those kinds of things help us date buildings. The porches, does it have a porch that's integrated into the body of the house, into the main roof of the body of the house? Does it have just a stoop? Does it have a wraparound porch, a corner porch? All of these types of things. The material itself, knowing when these materials were available, is super helpful as well to identify the form and the style as well. The one that I always like to throw out there, is T111 siding, basically plywood with grooves in it. T111 and stands for textured 111, which means there's a 1 inch groove every 11 inches. When did that become available to the public? When could you find it at their local building store? 1957 is when it was in use. So that'll give you a built date, and that'll tell you something about the style and the form of the building as well. Okay, hopefully everybody's on the same page. Is there any questions so far? I'll stop for a second.
Nothing in the chat.
Okay, excellent. Um, First of all, I want to talk about some typical residential related forms, and then I want to talk about some commercial related forms. So, the three books that are probably the best books out there are obviously the McAllister Guidebook, Field Guide to American House, but Alan Gallen's Comfortable House is great, and there's a fairly new book that talks about common houses in small town America. That's a pretty good book as well. Those are fun, good resources to have in your on your bookshelf in your library. The first one is probably the first term that I heard when I was learning about building forms is something called the I house. And when I saw this, when I heard the term, I was like, okay, that makes sense. When you look at the house from the side, it's tall and skinny. Okay, it looks like an I. Well, the guy who coined the term found these houses in Iowa, Indiana, and Illinois. So that's why he called them the I houses. However, they're all over the place. They're all over the country, and this is what they look like in Washington State. So tall and skinny, one room deep. Um, and these have subtypes as well. So if you look at these, their subtypes are based on the bays of the building. Granted, they don't have traditional bays, but bays of windows, if you will, or rhythm of windows. So the one in Kelso would be a 4-bay I-house model, a 2-bay model right up top in Everett. Most of these houses have additions in the rear called an L, an ELL. Sometimes they're 2 stories, sometimes they're just a little 1 story, sometimes they don't have them at all. These are early sort of designs on landscape. So they're not only found in rural Washington State, but you can also find them in the middle of the city as well. So those are fun. You'll find them around 1880s all the way until about 1905, maybe 1910. there's quite a few of them out there in Washington. So those are fun to look at. Then there's also one of the things I should point out that don't note the door, the entrance door is on the long end, not on the gable end, right? So on the eave line end. The homestead house or the gable fronter, the entranceway is on the short end of the house, like you see in this model here. So just rotated, flipped, and these are super common in Washington as well. With their entrance, they're going to be a two-story, story and a half. Nice little models, different architectural styling sort of applied to these, kind of from the Victorian era to, little classical revival sort of pieces, like you see this one down in Spokane, to some Italianate details, like you see the one in Bellingham with its little Italianate bay window and bracketed eaves. Those are fun to find and document. Here's another little version called the upright and wing. These are basically, if we looked at them in plan or the gabled L, they would be an L shape building. And often they have their entranceways within the L on the sort of lower subservient portion, like this one in Vancouver and LaConner and Bellingham. Some of the others might have that in the taller sort of version. So little L shapes, a gabled L. Pretty fun to find. Usually these things are pretty, well, these are, we can see different architectural styles kind of applied to these as well. So easy to find and spot as well. What about the American Foursquare? Sort of the big box house, right? This is one of those forms that various style can be applied to the form. So classical revival, craftsman style, prairie style, Spanish style. They are really all over the place in terms of that style that is applied to them, but they all have the same basic form, a big box, even though they're called four squares being square on either side. Most of them really aren't too square. Most of them are actually rectangular in shape, usually deeper than they are wide from the street. Um, so those are fun to sort of find. And in Washington State, you might have heard the term Seattle box, referring to the American Foursquare design. But the unique part about this design, although it's not really that unique to Seattle, as you can see here, is these little second floor dormers, kind of these overhanging extended corner box. Not dormers, but bay windows, I guess, if you will, on the corner. So that's the classic Seattle box that you'll see. These show up around 1905-ish, 1910, late examples. So this is a two-story Seattle box. It's a box with they all have to have hip roofs, different style applied to them, as you can see from the photos. Here's a smaller version called the working man's Foursquare. So I guess if you weren't rich enough to afford the big, full-blown American Foursquare design, you could build this other tiny little house, a little starter home, if you will, back in the day. Um, a lot of them have a central chimney, which you're seeing up at the top, right at the very top of that pyramidal roof or hip roof. Um, some have porches, full-blown porches, wraparound porches. No integrated porches usually an attached porch. So if you looked at a lot of these things in plan, they would have four equal rooms. Same with the American Foursquare, sort of four equal size rooms inside as one of the character features, but not getting too much into floor plans because we don't get inside buildings a lot when we're doing survey work. So easy to spot from the street. Moving forward to talk about sort of the ranch house. I think everybody knows a ranch house when they see a ranch house, but how do you classify these things in terms of their form? And I started looking sort of around the country as to what other jurisdictions are doing. And boy, it's all over the place. Some people just kind of have ranch, um, like we do. Some, talk about little sub styles of ranches. Here's a more of a typology style in Fresno. Um, I don't know what a semi-custom ranch is versus a simple ranch versus a transitional ranch in Boulder. Um, if you went over to Scottsdale, Arizona, they've gone full in on sort of describing the ranches in terms of the style, break them down by big style types. Um, that's a fun one to look at. I think the Georgia model is probably one of the best to look at because they look at style and they look at the typology as well. And when we look at ranches for the typology, we're really looking at the floor plan, which you can kind of see in this example over here. So alphabet ranches, that's the alphabet in terms of the floor plan, a U shape, an A shape, a V shape, versus a linear versus a courtyard model, maybe a U shape to the front or a U shape to the back, those sorts of things. We can certainly talk about ranch typologies and ranch style at another training if there is an interest in that. So you can see the variety. These would all be called ranch houses, but they all look very, very different. So ranch being, 1 story low, usually don't have a front porch, but maybe just a stoop. Lots of different styles that are applied to sort of this ranch form. Easy to find, easy to spot. What about bungalow? Everybody knows what a bungalow is, right? But do you know what a bungalow is? Bungalow really could be applied to any of these sorts of designs because by definition, bungalow is a small house with a porch. And these obviously have lots of different sort of styles applied to them. So this term bungalow is an Indian word actually that shows up a very long time ago, sort of at the 17th century, as a house that's sort of describing what you might find in Bengal in India, hence bungalow, a house from Bengal. And then in the 1870s, it starts to show up in England as a term that builders use to describe these small little vacation cottages. Um, um, Usually for wealthy folks. And then, of course, in the 19th century, in the 1900s, in the 20th century, that term sort of filters over into the US, but mainly attached to a style. And that style that we think of is something that looks like this, right? The Craftsman bungalow. So a style that's applied to a building form. So in DAHP's database in the wizard pick list, bungalow is there. However, if you want to get super picky, you could go down the path of looking at roof forms to sort of define, hey, if I want to look at all the bungalows, you're going to get a huge list. Scott, I see your hand is up.
So just for clarification, you would say a bungalow necessitates a front porch.
Typically, yes. Typically, yes.
Great.
However, it gets watered down, right? Because I think what we hear from bungalow in the sort of mass media real estate market, uh, is kind of all over the place. It's kind of like using the term rambler, right?
Sure.
Um, yeah.
How
So, yeah, good question.
is like so to what how large does that I mean where do you separate a stoop from a porch?
Ah, yeah. Where
Or
do you
maybe a
separate a
set of
stoop from
stairs
a
with a
porch?
landing
Yeah,
versus a full porch.
I think a stoop really is just a place that you can stand. A porch really has more space that you can kind of hang out on. It's probably the difference between a stoop and a porch. So a stoop is just covering that main entranceway of the door. You can knock on the door, but you can't sit down anywhere. That's probably the difference. So with these bungalows, we're seeing space that you can hang out on, whether it's, these hip roof bungalows or a side-facing bungalow. Um, there's more typologies of these. These sort of sub typologies that I'm throwing out here are not in Wizard, although you can find some of the roof forms in Wizard. But if you wanted to do a multiple property documentation or a study of craftsman bungalows in your town, I would hope that you would go to the extra effort to sort of break down these into subtypes so you can kind of understand the history and the development of those and how rare a certain sort of subtype might be, subform might be in your community or the community that you're surveying. The funnest one to look at is I'm hoping that you all have seen this one. This is the airplane bungalow, which is kind of crazy to think about. So think about this little spot up at the top as the cockpit, and then sort of the main, that little extra cockpit up top, and then the main body of the house is sort of the wings of the plane down below. Those are called airplane bungalows. Find lots of them in California. Fairly unusual in Washington State, but we do have some spread all over the state, as you can see from these photos. So they're fun to look for and find out. Okay, how are we doing on time? 12:30. Good. I wanted to show you some commercial building forms that you should be aware of. These are all forms that are found in DAHP's database, and most of them are taken from Richard Longstreth's Guide to Buildings on Main Street. He is the guy that sort of set the tone. So like McAllister and her guidebook for residential designs, Richard is the guy really when we're talking about commercial properties. So the first, basic one that you'll find is called a one-part commercial block. It's a one-story, simple form. And Richard's book, by the way, is really focused in on kind of that early architecture, sort of the 1900s, 1800s architecture. But most of those can be applied to sort of later buildings as well. So I'm throwing in some post-World War stuff that you can see. So these are all sort of, one-part block buildings. I think it'll make more sense in a minute because there is something called a two-part block building that has a defined first story and a defined second floor. Two-part blocks, so two blocks stacked on top of each other. Think about Legos, two blocks stacked on top of each other with a distinct difference between the two. What about a stacked vertical block if you have multiple blocks stacked on top of each other? So 3 stories, 4 stories, they all have a distinct sort of flavor to them divided between those floors. So stacked vertical blocks. One-part vertical blocks. So a block that's a one part, but it goes up multiple stories, all sort of a continuous facade. Might be applied to this crazy building in Federal Way, that slick skin corporate modern style that's applied to that. But you can also find them in the 30s and the 20s. So the one-part vertical block. Then there's the two-part vertical block, of course, because the storefront looks slightly different. It's got its own distinct character, but everything above that is the same as it goes all the way up to the top, up to that cornice line. Easy to see. Once you kind of see these things, you're like, okay, yeah, that makes sense. I'm getting it. I'm getting it. I hope you're getting it. What about the three-part vertical block? So now we've got 3 separate elements that are distinct from each other. So you've got your base. When we talk about three-part blocks, oftentimes, in fact, when we talk about commercial archaeology, we use the sort of reference to a column. So a base, a shaft, and a capital. So the base would be the storefront sort of area. The shaft is the in-between floors, and then the capital is usually the top floor, which involves a cornice and maybe a floor itself. So on these buildings, you'll see 3 different components that are distinct from each other. Even the one in Spokane, the Lincoln building, right? It has a first floor with a middle that's distinctive, and actually that overhang on the top. There's another floor up there that's recessed. So three-part vertical block, easy to find. Buildings that look like a vault, just a massive sort of arched entranceway, which kind of defines that whole structure. A vault form could be applied to sort of later structures like the Bank in Toppenish. Not a great example, but it gives us that sort of breaking down typology, right? So we can start to do some of that comparative analysis. Flat iron buildings. Now we're not necessarily looking at the elevation and the stacks of components, but we're looking at the floor plan, the shape of the building, which comes to a nice skinny point on a corner. So flat iron buildings. looks like an iron, like an old style iron, or even a new iron for that matter. So that sort of shape of an iron. Easy to spot. Buildings that are reflective of a Greek temple, a temple front on those buildings. Rows of columns, rows of engaged pilasters. You can kind of see these all over. These are obviously going to be earlier buildings, not necessarily post-World War II buildings, but temple fronts out there. Lots of examples of a temple front, but have some distinct kind of components on either side of them that are usually blank. Might be applied to sort of a mid-century building like the one in Wenatchee. So you've got your kind of rows of columns, but then distinct forms on the end. So an enframed block. Central block with wings. So a main portion on the middle of the building, usually higher, and then subservient wings on the side. So a central block with wings. You'll see that form a lot on Art Deco, streamlined modern buildings of the 1930s, but you can also find them, like at the City Hall in Stillicum on, that sort of colonial revival sort of buildings, or even the mid-century bank in Yakima, central block with wings. Then there's something that we call the arcaded block, just massive round arches all the way down the facade. Um, More an unusual building form out there. Remember, there's strip commercial as well. So you've got, buildings that might be in isolation as just a standalone commercial building out in Everett or attached. Usually these strip commercial are attached buildings, all one building, sharing a like facade, but have different sort of stores within them. So just examples around, these things are quickly disappearing and many of them get heavily altered. So if you find one of these when you're out surveying, you definitely want to record them and document them. And if you're an owner, preserve them before they get remodeled. One of my favorites down in Lakewood. And same can be said for the infamous mall, right? Malls are Everybody knows what a mall is, but how do you classify a mall? I think you look at the sort of the bigger sort of idea of a mall and all these connected big box stores and subservient stores, but it's easy to sort of, you can go into sort of sub characteristics of the one in particular anchor store and what that looks like and what the stylistic details might be of that anchor store. But a mall is sort of that collective, uh, if you will. So where do we find out about all these things? We have a site in Wizard that's got architectural styles and building forms on it. This is more of a passion project for myself, so I have been over the years sort of adding things to that. Unfortunately, I have other duties, so it's not huge on my high priority list, but there is things there. And as normal, you can always call me. You can always call any of the DAHP staff. We are here to help. There are no dumb questions. So feel free to ask if you've got something you just want to know about it. Please call, email. Uh, Photo is, super important. And I love to answer stylistic informed questions. That's the fun part of the job for me. That's my contact info. Um, Please feel free to call us, text me, tweet me, send me a letter, that sort of thing. Kim, what do we got in the chat? Any questions?
Michael, there are no questions in the chat. Oh,
Awesome.
but there is a request for a ranch focused academy. So
A ranch focused academy.
we'll put that in
Okay.
2027.
Yes.
All
Yeah, we can definitely do that. Absolutely.
right. Well, thanks everyone for joining us. We're happy to see you all as always. And we will see you for the next DAP Academy. Take care, everyone.
Great. Bye-bye, everyone.